I'm assuming that people would know GitHub.
Yeah, I was going to say, I hope.
Hello and welcome. In today's episode of How It's Built, we're talking with Ryan Nystrom. Ryan is a director of engineering at GitHub, supporting the teams building mobile and desktop apps. Hope you enjoyed.
And it's great to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm stoked to kind of talk about some of the stuff we've been doing.
Can you give some of your kind of thoughts, what the mobile app is for GitHub?
Yeah. So I joined GitHub in like May of 2019, actually to start the mobile app. I had built an open source GitHub app called GitHawk that just caught GitHub's attention. Literally, the CEO DM'd me on Twitter and was like, "This is pretty neat. Let's talk about this." And like one thing led to another, and eventually our ideas and values kind of aligned, and they were like, "You just seem like a good fit to come here and to build our app." It was something that strategically GitHub has been wanting to do for a long time. And the stars just kind of aligned, and it was like a perfect opportunity. So I joined and literally, started a new Xcode project, brought over a bunch of ideas and stuff from GitHawk. We started with what was just me, and our designer has now grown into an iPhone app, the iPad app, the Android app, and a bunch more. And I am also now starting to oversee GitHub's desktop app and command line app. From the get-go, we decided we're not going to just like rebuild GitHub in Swift and try to stuff it into an iPhone. We decided to be pretty opinionated and stick with a couple core workflows we thought that mattered a lot to people when they were trying to use GitHub on the go. And this was a lot of experience that I had gained through building GitHawk. And it's mostly tailored around notifications, triaging notifications, responding and organizing issues. And then probably what I'm most excited about is actually like reviewing code and merging code, which I can kind of dig into is turned out to be like the surprising star feature of our app.
And just to give a sense of scale to our viewers, how big is the team now?
So we have about 4 or 5 engineers on each platform. So 4 or 5 on iOS, 4 or 5 on Android. We have a couple engineers that work on the API specifically for our mobile app. We have 2 designers and then a product manager. And then to kind of keep all of that organized, we have 2 managers, 2 engineering managers, and then myself. So I kind of oversee all of mobile.
Do you get to write any code these days, or are you mostly kind of making sure that the team is working smoothly?
It's maybe controversial. I actually still write quite a bit of code. I never put myself on what I call like the critical path. So if I'm ever working on something like really important, and then I get pulled off into something else, like that would be devastating to the team. So what I try to look out for polish items, bugs, performance stuff, dev tooling and things. Not because I have to, but I want to stay. I want just to like stay empathetic to our code base. This week was a crazy example because I literally built this tiny feature on iOS. I polished some UI on Android. I added a command flag on our CLI app, and then was still doing a bunch of like manager product stuff. It sounds crazy, but it's super fun. I think it's really, really fun, and it helps me. I mean, this was like one of the first PRs I had put up for our command line app, and I like came back to the team and I was like, this is the smoothest onboarding experience I have ever used. And I used GitHub's code spaces to do it. I was like, I just clicked a button, I ran make on the command line, and then I ran make test, and everything just like worked. And it was fun for me to be able to bring that feedback back to the team and really appreciate the all the work and effort that had gone into making that experience good.
First question that I wanted to kind of ask you is that the app itself seems, as you mentioned, it's focused on very particular flows, and it's kind of highly dynamic in a sense that you can get from one place app to the, like there are many to many relationship between every kind of screen. And so can you talk a bit about high level organization of the kind of navigation, and how does coordination of the app navigation works?
At its core, it's pretty vanilla UI kit. I would say somewhere between MVC and MVVM. We both come from Facebook. We've seen when an app gets really big, navigating around an app can be crazy. And if one screen of your app navigates to the other screen, and you don't have any sort of abstraction on how that like navigation or routing works, all of a sudden these two view controllers are coupled to each other, and all the dependencies of one are going to be the dependencies of another. And then if that that destination view controller has another destination, now you're like root, the dependency like list goes out of control. GitHub has a lot of places you can navigate to, and we only support in the app like a tiny subset of it, but it's still a lot of stuff. I mean, you can go from a notification to a pull request to a repository to a user to a repository to a list of issues to a and it just goes on and on and on and on and on. I didn't want to have this app with this just gigantic bucket of circular dependencies. Probably within the last like 4 months or so, we've landed on our latest version of like a routing library. At its core, we define routes as structs. So say you've got like a user route, and that route will have data. So a user route might just be like the username, and maybe they'll we use GraphQL, so maybe like the GraphQL ID. That route you will register in some like global entry point for the app. And with that registry comes a factory, like basically a function or a closure. So for a user route, return some sort of view controller. And in that closure is where you'll initialize your like user view controller, let's say, and inject whatever sort of properties from that route. And then that's kind of it. It sounds really simple because it is like really simple. The beauty of this system is in order to trigger a route, our API takes advantage of the responder chain. And so from any place in the responder chain, it could be a view controller, could also just be a view. You can initialize like a user route that is, like I said, just a username string, and then like a GraphQL ID, maybe an int. And then from that place that triggers some action, you tell the responder chain, perform this route. That bubbles up the chain, finds kind of like a route performer. And then that does all the sort of like magic of looking up, okay, what route is registered to, or what factory is registered to perform, a user route. It executes that factory, which will return a view controller. And then it figures out, depending on the state of the app, the view controller configuration, iPad, iPhone, and some other preferences, either pushes, displays, presents the view controller or something. So we do have some kind of like, I wouldn't call it magic, but a bunch of like the logic baked into like the route performer to do like the display and everything. But the nice part is that we end up with this just really boring, simple, predictable API of it's just structs. I'm just going to throw this struct into the responder chain, and somebody else is going to figure out like the execution and display. And the result of that is that you don't have this origin destination dependency chain, because the origin says, hey, perform this route, throws it up to some root performer who then creates and displays the other view controller. And the nice part about that is then structurally, these two view controllers can live in completely separate modules.
It's actually really interesting. Responder chain is not the most, it's a controversial API to some degree, right? Yeah. Especially on the Mac, when your window goes out of focus, like someone else gains the focus, and the responder chain is like kind of hard to predict. So what made you go with that direction?
It ended up just kind of being the simplest API that we could piggyback on top of. You're right. It does come with downsides. I mean, a simple one is we end up having to like box any sort of data, Swift data that we send in like an NS object. We have to use Objective-C selectors. Also, weirdly, we discovered that like the scene delegate, the new like iPad Windows stuff, the template has, it says it responds, or it is like a UI responder delegate or whatever, but it's not part of the responder chain. And so we end up having to do this kind of like weird dance where like it goes all the way up to like the app delegate, who then like informs somebody to perform the actual route.
Okay. Yeah. I'm guessing that the cost of, you mentioned boxing types, so I'm guessing the cost of that is not too significant because it happens only on user action or
exactly.
some sort of, so it should be fine. Okay, and then so what I was really curious about to hear is that so this magic kind of works and you throw the request and then someone else handles like, oh, we're going to present this view. So that's someone else who is responsible for creating new view controller and presenting it one way or another. How aware does this piece of infrastructure have to be of the rest of the state of the app?
So I kind of mentioned that like there's like a route performer. And so this object also has what we call like a props data source. And so this props data source is where kind of like app state dependency injection happens. And so you would have, let's say like the app delegate that is kind of like the root app router. It's also going to have a reference to say like the current user session, to like the like networker client or something. And so when this factory is executed to create like a new, let's say, user view controller, not only are you provided the route, which is going to give you the user route that might have the ID and the username, you're also going to get this kind of bundle of like, we call them props, just kind of borrowing from React, but like properties, which will have anything, basically app-wide state information that you can then inject into the view controller. So, your current user session, your networker, we have stuff like global code settings, if you're going to change like the way code is displayed in the app, and those sort of things. So that way you can still inject basically any sort of like app state into your view controller without having to use notifications, reach into like singletons. We have almost no singletons in the app. The view controller itself will have an initializer that says like, it accepts maybe a user ID and is current user, because maybe like for the user view controller, we want to display like a settings button, maybe some other stuff if it's you. And if you're looking at somebody else's profile, we want to just have it be more standard. And so then the view controller itself has no knowledge about routing, routes, props, or any of this sort of stuff, which allows that view controller to live in like an entirely different module that doesn't have any dependencies on any of this infrastructure. Except probably the router, because the view controller, being part of the responder chain, wants to be able to, you're looking at your profile and you tap on, let's say, a list of repositories. We want to navigate you to another view controller, which is going to go through the whole routing infrastructure.
As you mentioned, there are many kind of destinations that any given view controller can potentially navigate to. So like you can navigate to user profile or like, as you mentioned, all the repositories or whatever. So is this information encapsulated in some sort of URIs that you can pass around? So like each individual view controller doesn't have to actually know, like this is how you construct a user route to throw it in the router. They're just going to take an opaque URI or like, how does that part work?
All of the route registry and the performing of like these factory methods would live in like your main app target. And so you would have a whole bunch of these like definitions in order to register these routes. So you end up with like a huge list of like stuff that you register, a huge list of factories and stuff, but that can live in like one place that is joining all of these dependencies together.
You guys use any sort of code genning for anything? You mentioned a lot of structs and routes and all that.
Not for any of the routing stuff. This usually ends up being pretty basic, writing a route and then writing the factory. The lines of code wise to create a new route and to create a new factory might end up being like 30 lines of code or something. It's pretty basic, very, very low maintenance. We use CodeGen for other stuff. We use Apollo for GraphQL, which code gens all of our queries. We have some code gen for like asset libraries and a couple other sort of like bootstrapping, like project bootstrapping things. But other than that, we don't use a ton of code gen.
I wanted to dive a bit deeper into the part where you mentioned a factory that in response to some routes, it will create view controller, and everything that goes with it. So let's start from generating this view controller. What is philosophy at GitHub? Do you use storyboards?
No storyboards. We have no storyboards whatsoever.
Why not?
Our launch interfaces. I've never liked them. And because I guess I was like the first engineer, I kind of seeded some of our engineering principles. I mean, I think that they're a pain in the butt to manage, like our projects. I think they're a pain in the butt to debug. I certainly think that there's some nice things about them, and I know some other like really big companies do use them. I think if I recall correctly, Lyft uses storyboards like very heavily. For a large engineering team, I think that's super impressive. We did use it for a couple things early on and replaced them because we ended up with some like debugging stuff that was just really tricky and complicated. We use auto layout for like everything. And I think that's where some of this got complicated. Like we just wanted to have more control, more explicitness over our constraints and in colors and view configuration and like all of this stuff. It certainly comes with a cost. Like there's a lot of constraint management. There's a lot of like boilerplate, like config and setup, but with a lot of our like asset code gen, we use SnapKit for auto layout. And I think that makes API like really easy. I know that some people love it, some people hate it, but it works pretty well for us. It's a lot easier, I guess, to rationalize. Not only is it easy to rationalize, I think when it comes to code review, just looking at code is way easier to understand versus seeing a whole bunch of what is basically XML and trying to make sense of it, versus like reading the actual constraint logic.
Storyboards is a topic people kind of debate, but I wanted it to be a bit more of a like factual rather than just opinions. And so things that you mentioned are potentially harder to review, potentially more implicit code. And so like several sources of truth where you might have some sort of property set in the code or in storyboards, and then you're going to have to track it down. So I'm kind of curious, like some of those points are actually solvable. And over years, DevTools team at Apple, they kind of solved problem of making storyboards more modular. So you can have storyboard that reference other storyboards, et cetera. So let's say that all of a sudden someone makes a plugin for, let's say, GitHub, so that in pull requests, you can actually see visual difference of your UI. What would change your opinion on storyboards? It's
a great question. I don't think that would change my opinion on storyboards. The explicitness of the code, the searchability of the code outside of Xcode and without needing any, you could have just like, you could check the project out in VS Code or just do some like greps in your terminal and be able to like find stuff. I think is a big value to me. It's also just very easy to trace when you're debugging, when certain dependencies are injected, when certain things are configured in a certain way. There would have to be additional value, I think, in order to like change our mind. I think that just having like a visual representation would certainly be nice, but I don't think it would justify the cost and effort to go and change what we do. And I think at its core, that's one of my biggest principles is I am opinionated on patterns, but I'm willing to change my mind and I'm willing to try new things. But I favor consistency over everything.
Sure.
I would so much rather have a certain pattern, and maybe it's got some downsides. And then if we're going to go to a new pattern, a new technology or something, then let's switch like 100% to this new thing, so that we don't end up with a code base that's got a bunch of like, it feels just kind of scattered. What are your thoughts on SwiftUI? Would you consider that? Does it address some problems that you kind of mentioned with
Storyboards?
So we support a minimum of iOS 13, and we actually have shipped SwiftUI in a couple small places, which does kind of break my principle. But we went at it with a kind of a ship to learn mindset of like, let's try it, let's see how do we get our project in a place where we can support previews. Let's try this. We had like basically one engineer ship a small feature in SwiftUI, and then kind of report back on like what worked, what didn't work. It took a long time. It took a long time for us to get stuff design-wise into a place that we really, really liked. There were some downsides. It was mostly just due to learning curve to get things exactly how we wanted them. And we're certainly open to it. I think it's the future. I'm ready to do it like 100%. I still think just what I've read, what I've seen, and like the very minimal SwiftUI that I've ever written, it feels too early. And it also, getting to code review, the code's really hard for me personally to read and to reason. And that's just like an education thing, but there's so much kind of like implicitness in Swift going on with SwiftUI that it's hard for me to follow. But I think that it's getting a whole lot better, even in 1 year. It's come a long, long way. So no doubt that like we are going to eventually be using it and probably rewriting almost everything in it. I would love to start building some smaller components, some smaller UI components, and kind of sprinkling them in the app like we've done where it makes sense. And then, just as the technology matures, start investing in it more and more.
Okay, let's maybe move to, again, this app is like heavily reliant on networking.
Our networking stack is kind of simple. We rely on Apollo to abstract our GraphQL queries heavily. And that's worked out, honestly, like fantastic. There's actually a pretty recent GitHub engineering blog post out there somewhere on how we use Apollo that goes into a ton of detail. But the gist is, we write queries, we write GraphQL queries, we run an Apollo script, which generates all of our actual queries and mutations and objects for us. That lives in a separate module. We import that module into the main app and just call these queries kind of at will. We don't allow any actual like networking code in like product code. So all of our view controllers will actually depend on some sort of like interface. Say, if I'm going to fetch a list of repositories, we'll have like a repositories view controller client protocol, which has an API that says fetch repositories with a like completion block and a result. And what's nice about this is that, again, we can kind of have, same with routing, we can kind of have these like self-contained view controllers that don't really depend on, they don't depend on Apollo, they don't depend on networking, they're not doing any networking themselves. Instead, they're telling this API, give me a list of repositories. You'll return an array of repository view models or repository models, and then I'll configure them and show them in a list. So we have like a client that will then conform to these protocols, and internally we'll be doing we'll be depending on Apollo or our Apollo module, do the networking, do the parsing, convert an Apollo model into an app domain model. So we don't actually use the Apollo generated models in our view code either. Which lends itself to boilerplate. Like that's probably the biggest downside of this pattern is you end up doing a lot of like mapping from this like repository view model to or repository GraphQL model to like a repository view model, which ends up being like parameter repo name equals repo.name, parameter repo owner equals repo.owner.
Yeah. What is the upside of that?
The actual practical upside of it, two things. One of it is testing. So our view controllers don't depend on an actual, or don't ever call or know about any networking, no like data tasks, no URL sessions or any of this stuff. So when we are creating a test, we can just simply create a mock client that can be like a struct that conforms to this protocol that when called can return, instantly return, or call this like completion closure with like a list of mocked repositories. So we're able to test the actual view state. We're able to use snapshot tests for this stuff. The other benefit of this, I guess two more benefits, is we can create separate apps. We can create separate modules. We had the fortunate opportunity to build a retail demo version of our app for Apple, which is in app stores globally, thousands of app stores globally, which is really cool. And that app is actually just our current app, but instead of using a real networking client, it's a fake networking client. And now there's like, I felt really bad for one of the engineers on our team because I loved this architecture decision, but we ended up spending the last 2 weeks before we shipped this just like mocking and mocking and mocking. It's like hundreds, maybe thousands of lines of like mocked data. And especially like the data has to look good too. So we're like working with our designer and like tweaking strings and all of this stuff. It was a grind, but the result of it is so easy to understand. It's so easy to change. And if you change anything with the actual product, the retail demo like build fails because it compiles with the actual like view controllers, client interfaces, which is really, really nice. And the last thing on top of that is similarly, we can inject a fake client to generate like app store screenshots and those sort of things. So we end up just being able to automate a whole lot. It does come with the downside of like lots of boilerplate,
Right.
but I think it's very, very much worth it.
To take a step back, I wanted to kind of talk a bit more about, you mentioned GraphQL. So can you just in 2 words describe what GraphQL is and what was your decision behind going with that and not, let's say, REST API or something like that?
I am by no means a GraphQL expert. Similarly, coming from Facebook, I know Facebook was using GraphQL heavily. On Instagram, we were just using basic REST. The nice part about GraphQL is, especially with GitHub, we kind of expose the entire data graph of GitHub via an API. And instead of finding an engineer on, say, the repositories team, and we need to build a specific a mobile-specific REST endpoint that has very tailored data that we need, we as client engineers can write a query on the client and then hit the server and get the data that we've requested. And so that just enables us to move like really, really quickly as client engineers and not needing to involve server engineers for every new API or tweak or change that we might need. Now, it's interesting at GitHub because we actually have like fully featured REST APIs and GraphQL APIs. And every once in a while, there's something that the REST API does really well that we'll fetch and use that. But our apps are probably like 98% GraphQL.
From my personal experience at Facebook, not only as a client engineer, you kind of feel empowered to, optimize your queries and like add fields, remove fields, whatever. But when the field is missing, pretty easy to go and expose additional fields from the backend. And it's pretty modular in that sense. Playing with the app, I noticed that it seems like some parts of the app are being cached on the disk, or maybe my network is just, that 5G network is just so fast. So can you talk a bit more about caching and kind of do you hit the network every time, or is there any sort of logic that sits at?
We hit the network basically every time. We take advantage of a stock SQLite cache that comes with Apollo. So we're able to cache objects based on their query and the object ID. And Apollo will do kind of the storage for us. And almost, not all of our interfaces, but a lot of our interfaces will try to fetch the cache data and simultaneously hit the network. So that way you can see stuff quickly. Ideally, we have some sort of like spinner or loading indicator so that something is happening, and when stuff changes, it's not too much of a shock. We use that for most of our caching. I'm trying to think if we do any like selecting. I don't really think so. Maybe like our notifications because we want that to feel super snappy. But otherwise, we use the Apollo caching for basically everything. I'd like to do more of it. Like I'd like to use more of it. We have some issues where like cache entries get replaced, they get clobbered, they get purged. So we have like less control over the caching. This is probably something I kind of wish we like did differently from the beginning, is to start with some sort of like caching data persistence mechanism, object storage. I mean, even something like core data, like from the get-go, and that anytime we're like fetching stuff from the network that we're updating entries, in some sort of like centralized persisted store, instead of kind of having to rely on this cache that is like keyed off of IDs. It works good, but we're probably like hitting its limitations right now.
Yeah, it's actually interesting with any app that is dependent on the networking heavily. You have two kind of, well, you have many directions, but two of them would be, yeah, you can always hit the network and kind of display the results as they come in, or you can design it in a way where your app is always looking at the cache and displaying local data, and then some mechanism goes off and fetches data and updates it in the cache, and then you that's kind of like core data approach when you notice the changes in local data. And so the nature of the data for GitHub, do you find it to be way more kind of dynamic, and like there are not too many opportunities to cache things to begin with?
That is ultimately why we made the decision that we did. That there is just a lot of data. The object graph at GitHub is huge, and it changes all the time. Since we're talking about networking, like one of the things I want to eventually do is take advantage of WebSockets or like GraphQL subscriptions and actually like listen for updates, like fetch deltas and update stuff dynamically. We just haven't had the time yet to do that. But we have had debates about like, should we just persist basically every single piece of data that's in the app into some central store, and like you said, update the store, emit an event, and then things update. The problem is like that the definition of that store is going to be huge. The complexity of it is going to be crazy. Like the updating, the migrations that are going to have to happen, going to be a huge pain in the butt for stuff that ultimately we've kind of decided like you can't use GitHub offline. There are things that I'd love to be able to do offline. I'd love to be able to. We don't support this today, but I'd love to be able to like file an issue for a particular repository if I'm like in the subway, put the phone in my pocket, and when it comes back online, boom, goes and posts it. Those sort of things I think are great, but they're very sort of like specific features that we would say like this needs to work offline. I don't think that it would make sense for our entire app to work offline unless we were going to be doing something with like pulling an entire repository's like file contents and saving that to some storage, and you're going to edit that and then we'll push the changes later. But we aren't doing any of that stuff right now. I think if we're pulling like pull request timeline entries and metadata and the number of people that have reacted to something, it just makes sense for that to be online. And you also run the risk of, if it does work offline, somebody doesn't notice they're offline or the request is slow, they might think, oh, that's the latest. When they put their phone away, then they go to their computer and realize like, oh, geez, it's like changed. And now you've kind of like lost a bit of trust with the user. Where they're like, wait, maybe the stuff I'm seeing on this phone is not actually right. And that's something we don't want to do.
At the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned that one of the core values of the GitHub app is notifications, right? And so as far as networking in notifications, you also mentioned that you don't really use sockets yet. So is that just some sort of polling that you periodically do, or how does it work?
Yeah, we fetch both for a couple of our screens. We fetch first load, or like when the view first appears, and then we do have some kind of like background timers that when you leave the screen and come back after a certain period of time, we refresh. They're pretty basic. We're listening for like app foreground, background events, but we also kind of monitor when the view goes on and off screen. So say you're looking at your notifications, you open a pull request, and then you are reading and responding and reviewing for like 5 minutes or something, and you hit the back button, we want to actually refresh that page. We don't do any sort of like continuous polling. Some of our queries are expensive, and we don't want to be draining your phone's battery life. We also like computationally don't want to be just like blasting the GitHub API with these big GraphQL queries all the time. So we do try to be a little careful about like over polling. And I think that so far it's worked out pretty well for us. There's a couple like edge cases and bugs that are kind of annoying. Say for instance, you open the app from a push notification, takes you directly to like the pull request. You go back to your notifications page. It might not have refreshed yet with the notification you just got. That's something where it's like I want to fix that. But at the same time, I don't want to be like fetching every 10 seconds or something. This was like one of my, so like I said, I try to keep myself like off of the critical path. And this was definitely one of my projects. So this is like, I guess, one of my like side projects over the course of probably tinkered on this for like a month or two. I had a lot of fun making our app work for iPad. So when Apple announced a lot of the new split view controller stuff for iOS 14, I was like, this is it. This is awesome. Previously, we had like a tab bar experience that was like app wide. It worked pretty well, but like it was kind of annoying to just always have this big strip of a tab bar with only 3 tabs that like span the entire bottom of my screen. And like I just wanted a way to replace it. And we had gone through, our designer and I had gone through so many iterations and so many brainstorms and just like couldn't land on something that we liked. Then we saw Apple, who was like, look, we got the sidebar thing. And I was like, that's it. But what I instantly realized is like, this is iOS 14 only. We can't support this, kind of dead on arrival. But then I started like hacking and tinkering, and actually got this all working on iOS 13. So I'm running iOS 14, but this split view here is not using any of the new APIs. This is actually all just like vanilla split view. And what it actually is this panel here on the left is the master view, or like the main view of the root split view. And then this panel, including all of this stuff in here, is the detail of that main. And then inside here is another split view where this is the main view and this is the detail view, this took like a whole lot of work, mostly because like getting like the embedded split view is a pain in and of itself. But like getting this to work where like the sidebar button like updates, and then getting like this stuff to work with like the flyover was kind of like a pain in the butt. And then even being able to go like deeper in the app, collapse, and then move like the sidebar here, and then go back, and now the sidebar button's over here because I'm actually like inside a navigation controller as well. Was a huge pain in the butt. And then in addition to all of this stuff, being able to support like a ton of keyboard shortcuts, which originate from the sidebar, from the list view, from the detail view, and components all within it. So being able to write like a key command traverser that's able to go and grab all the key commands, execute, or then on detecting one of these commands, go and find the actual, because key command is the craziest API I've ever worked with. It's like all selector based. There's no target. It's just selectors. So we do some like crazy mapping to figure out who actually responds to the key command. But I'm very proud of this whole setup. I can take this in that same instance. It also all collapses. So I can go here and then tap all the way through to the root.
Nice.
And then pull this open over on the side here, continue navigating, and then pull it open here. The split view goes to like a popover view.
Oh, that's really cool.
And then all the way back, and there it's back again. So there's a whole bunch of just like wrangling and learning about UIKit and bending UIKit to my will. But I think it resulted into something really cool. And it feels very special to be able to give this to folks using iOS 13. And there's actually parts about this design that I think are potentially better than the iOS 14 design. One of them is that this nested kind of split view in here, we can actually push something. Oops, let's find a push. Let's go to files change. Can actually push this screen here, which gets rid of the entire split view in here. Whereas the new iOS 14 API, if you push, it's just going to replace this rightmost pane here and leave this split view here, which is like, okay, now I'm looking at a list of files, and then my middle view is a list of notifications. Like that's kind of funky. It's kind of nice to actually be able to jump into this and, say I want to go view code full screen. This is like a very nice interface to do that.
it's kind of funny how it looks so simple and kind of, oh yeah, of course it works this way. But when you explain everything that goes into it, it's just insane.
It's not simple.
Yeah. Are you thinking about kind of reconciling macOS app and iPad app?
So our desktop app has existed for probably like close to a decade. It used to be a native Mac app and a native Windows app. And about like 3 years ago, we rewrote it in Electron. So the desktop app that exists today is really focused on abstracting and simplifying using Git, and is entirely built in Electron. Now, I'm not gonna lie, like there's been a lot of times we've like looked at some of the split view stuff. We've looked at SwiftUI, we've like looked at Catalyst, and we start like daydreaming about like, this would be really cool. But you know, being in like the Apple ecosystem, sometimes it's really easy to forget how few people actually use like Macs. You know, by and large, GitHub users are on Windows, and we have a ton on Linux as well. And so, like, while I really want to do it, and I think it would be really cool, and I'm sure we're gonna like at one of our upcoming hackathons make it work. I don't know if it's going to do the best service to our users, because then we're going to end up having to support it, and everything that we designed is now going to have to consider how it looks on the Mac, and it's only going to benefit a smaller population of our users. Whereas our desktop app today supports Mac and Windows, and there's like an unofficial Linux fork that I think works really well, and it's supported by like a pretty lean team.
As engineers, we often get excited by technology, but then it's helpful to kind of keep that in mind. Like, what about the actual use case?
Yeah.
But yeah, that makes sense. While you were showing the iPad demo, I noticed that in the pull request kind of preview screen and all that, there is a lot of UI that's, if I would have to guess, it can be either native or web. So like, do you have any webby UIs in your mobile app?
All of our comments are rendered with WK WebView, and that's been pretty controversial internally. Controversial because it used to be native, and we rewrote it like 6 months ago to be WebView, and there are huge trade-offs. The native experience was super performant, but it lacked a lot of features, and we would constantly have bugs. The web experience, we have performance issues every once in a while, but it's so comprehensive with the GitHub flavored Markdown support. The straw that broke the camel's back is when we discovered that in GitHub flavored Markdown, you can write HTML tables that work with like call span and row span. And so we were previously rendering these tables natively with UI collection view inline. So all of our list views are table views. And so we had a table cell with an embedded collection view cell. And then we have to go and figure out like, okay, what if this row has a call span, you know, where it's supposed to, this one cell has a call span, and then this one has a row span, and then this one has an uneven number of rows. It was a nightmare. And we weren't even like fully supporting everything. And we ran into, we spent a lot of time making GIFs work, which we ended up getting work with TextKit. And it was really cool. I think it was super performant and looked great. But then like GIFs inside tables, usually tables is what broke us. It really broke us. But tables and block quotes and code blocks and like all of these things, you know, it eventually just got unwieldy. And so we moved everything to a WK WebView, which it was the right decision. I think we still have to like do some performance tuning, and we've done some really good work recently. We've spent a bunch of time engineering this. We do a lot of pretty aggressive preloading, warming up WebKit, caching these sizes, responding to trait collection changes, so handling dark mode, different font sizes. It works great. I think one of the other things I'd love to brag about with it is that the web view allows us to get all of like the text input stuff that you expect from like text. Being able to select the text, highlight the entire paragraph, even if it's got images, even if it's got tables, you can do all that sort of stuff. So I think in the end, it's a much better user experience. And while I come from Facebook, where we obsessed over like scroll performance and everything, having a finite list of like comments on a pull request, and also supporting minimum of iOS 13, which the device matrix is pretty high end. It ends up working like really, really good. I have an iPhone 7 here sitting on my desk, and it scrolls. It feels like butter, even with these web views. And you can get crazy. These web views can get crazy, and it still feels really good. So it's the only place though that we use web views is when we render Markdown. So in comments, Markdown files, profile readmes, repo readmes, those sort of things.
You mentioned that you render the everything that goes for comments in a web view. So do you get to maintain one front end both for your mobile website and iPad, or is that a separate front end that you had to write for your mobile app?
It's a separate front end. We did take a lot of the style sheets and stuff and bring them over to the app so that we can match all of the styles. But we had to do some tweaking because we want to make sure we're matching system fonts, system color themes, responding to like the trait collection changes. And there's a couple just like visual tweaks that we did need to make, not to mention just kind of like removing a bunch of style sheets that we don't use. So we're trying to keep it as minimal as possible to try and make it performant, considering it is a web view. But we did use a lot of the mobile web style sheets and stuff as like a baseline.
What is the aspirational / realistic roadmap for the mobile apps?
So one of the things that's actually on our GitHub publicized our company roadmap, and something we just published like 10 days ago, is enterprise support. So GitHub has everybody's that's familiar with GitHub is usually familiar with just github.com, open source stuff. But we also have what's called Enterprise Cloud, where companies can use kind of a tailored version of GitHub, but still hosted by GitHub, basically. But then there's another option that we have called Enterprise Server, which is where companies take like a version of GitHub and install it on premises, usually for security reasons, compliance reasons, data privacy and security and all that sort of stuff. And right now our app doesn't work on that because you can't enter like this custom domain. These enterprise installs will have like older versions potentially. And so there's like a capabilities sort of support that we need to have. We're actually working on that now and have committed to shipping that pretty soon. So that's one of the first things we're doing, which is technically complicated, but thankfully a lot of our architecture already supports this sort of stuff. We're able to inject, like I was talking about, we're able to inject clients and networking interfaces. And so the actual client implementation, if it's github.com, if it's a custom enterprise server, doesn't actually matter. The view controller doesn't really care. Now there's a lot more. I'm trivializing the amount of engineering work, but it's going to go into it.
I was going to say, yeah, it sounds too simple to be true.
It's pretty hard. It's going to be pretty hard, but the team is super confident. The fun part for us is that like GitHub is so huge that there's so much stuff that we can do. Some things that I really want to get into. A lot of the new like iOS stuff. I would love to play with widgets. I would love to play with shortcuts and extensions. I've even been just like tinkering with some like what could a GitHub shortcut look like, which has been really fun. But we try to be really cognizant before we don't want to just like ship hacks and then end up supporting it, and then we could put ourselves in a position where it becomes really costly to support, or we decide, oh, okay, this doesn't really work and we're going to delete it. But maybe some people have grown to really like it. And those are really hard decisions too. So we're trying to be really careful about what we do ship. Some stuff we're not committing to, but I like am really excited about is like some sort of like code editing or something. I find myself using the app in wanting to like just edit a file. Even though I do code, I spend most of my time writing documents and Markdown and stuff. I am a manager at the end of the day. And so like, I really want to be able to like edit Markdown in our app. And so that's something that we're talking about as a team. If it makes sense, there's, there's plenty of ways we could go about that, but I love like the web interface, just being able to click edit and edit code. I think something like that would be really fun. GitHub is releasing discussions. There's a handful of folks that have been using the beta discussions. We use it internally pretty heavily. I would love to see it on the app. Any sort of thing that we don't support in the app, we kind of bounce you out to a web view. So I would love to build that. I would love to build something for actions. I didn't think that I would want it, but now that I'm like pulling up pull requests and seeing the CI status, I'm like, oh, that failed. Why did that fail? I think there could be something really cool with like signing up or connecting to some WebSocket and like tailing the output of like all these logs, searching it, rerunning jobs and like all of that stuff. It's like a challenge. It's a challenge in exercise and prioritization, but like I love having too much to do, because then we can just do like the most impactful thing next.
Do you have any sort of client-side analytics / logging, and what is your approach to kind of make it less pervasive?
Fun story about this. At the 11th hour before we shipped our beta, we had been using a third-party like analytics SDK, and right before we shipped our beta, we were like going through like all of the kind of like data privacy stuff, and eventually like got to the point where we were just like we just didn't want our users' data going to this like third-party stuff. And yeah, it would have been so easy. We would have gotten all of these like metrics without like any, without writing any code. Like all of this out of the box metrics would have been so awesome. Understanding like which views people are going to, how much time they're spending in the app, getting some basic performance metrics. But we made the right call, I think, and we gutted it because we just felt too uncomfortable about sending our users' data to some provider. Which I know that providers are they're going to keep data secure, and they have their terms and all of that stuff. Like we could have figured it out, but it just didn't seem like the right move. That said, like we launched blind. We launched without any like analytics. We've got stuff in the App Store, in the Play console that's been helpful. When people interact with the API, we can kind of get a sense of like, how many comments are being left and some kind of basic stuff. But what's been kind of nice is that we grew to live with it, like to not have this super granular understanding of like what people are doing, which led us be able to strike this balance of like, what does the data say? What are our users telling us? And like, what do we think? And not just strictly chasing metrics. Really thinking deeply about what's the product we want, what are the problems that we see, what are the things we're excited about, like, and what are people telling us? Then we can do a little bit of kind of like back of the napkin validation with some of the metrics we've got, which honestly like kind of brings some of the like joy back to like building software and not being like so mechanical about it. In the past like few months though, we have built like a pretty lightweight analytics library, to be able to actually understand interactions with the app. One of the things I enjoy about it is it's kind of a pain in the butt to add new metrics to our app. And that friction forces us to be incredibly mindful about what we actually log, because you can't just like go and write a bunch of strings and dump some JSON into some analytics service and then it gets like logged to your server. It's pretty involved. And I like that. Like, I like that it makes us really think like, do we actually want this? Because this is going to be my afternoon adding this logging code. The result of that is that we have very few metrics, only through things that are like super important to us.
Vital, yeah.
Yeah. And the actual mechanics of it are pretty basic. We throw stuff into like a local SQLite store. We have like a service that wakes up every once in a while, grabs the stuff out of the store, sends them to .com, goes through our data pipeline, ends up in like a Hive or Presto at the end of it, which works really well for us. It's simple, it's basic. We really don't capture like any data besides what's more or less like counters, and gives us the information we need to make decisions and to continue following like our instincts and feedback from people rather than chasing metrics.
I'm guessing that GitHub is blessed in a way that you are heavily dogfooding your own kind of product, right? And so does that allow you to kind of gain any sort of insight of like, oh, we wanted to roll out this feature, but like from internal use, before it even hits any beta tier, we see that it's not exactly working the way we wanted to?
We were kind of aggressive on our beta testing. We really just ship stuff. We have within the settings of the app, we have a setting called feature preview. And we just like throw all of our new features in there. We don't really try to hide things unless it's something super secret, which has been incredibly rare. And the benefit of that is that we have upwards of 10,000 people in our test flight program. We just build new stuff. We put it in the release notes. We add this like feature preview toggle, and we send it to our test flight users pretty early. I think one of the benefits of our audience is that they're developers like us, and like we're hackers, we're tinkerers. We're really forgiving of like new tech. We know when new tech is like unstable. We know when new tech is going to change, and we love playing with new tech, and we're super opinionated about new tech.
A bit of a controversial question. So I might be wrong on this, but I think that I didn't see the repository of the mobile app.
It is not open source. The other two apps that I do manage, the command line app and the desktop app, are 100% open source, basically have been since their origin. Yeah, we get asked this a lot. And I have a ton of experience and background with open source. I authored and managed the Instagram's IGList Kit project, which ended up getting a pretty large community. I'm a huge fan of open source. I love it. It's not open source yet. Will it be open source? I'd maybe go as far as to say probably, but it's a really big decision that you can't reverse. And with a team as large as ours, open sourcing ads, it's going to add quite a bit of overhead. It also just like changes how we work. And some people on the team might not have necessarily signed up to be working publicly. There's a lot that comes with open source, and I experienced this a lot firsthand with community management. And it can be really tricky. We deal with incidences at GitHub with staff and with other open source repos all the time. And so it's not a decision that I would make really lightly, but it's something that I really value. I believe really strongly in. At the very, very least, what I'd love to see us do more of is open source libraries and components. This routing stuff I talked about. There's a bunch of other things that we've built internally that I think are really great, really cool, and people could benefit from. But yeah, we're talking about it all the time, and we do get asked all the time, even internally, about like, when are you going to open source? And it's something I definitely want to work towards.
All right, cool. Are you guys looking to hire people? Where can people reach out to you? Any sort of kind of closing remarks that you wanted to add?
Yeah. So a couple of things I'd plug. You can always find me on Twitter, _Ryan Nystrom on Twitter. DMs are open. Love hearing feedback. I love hearing like what you don't like about our app. So if there's something you wish that the app did or did differently, like I want to hear about that because that's super valuable. We also just this week publicized a feedback repository. So if you go to github.com/github/feedback, we're using discussions to actually publicly facilitate feedback about our mobile app. And so we want people like commenting, telling us features they want, things that they want us to build, do differently, etc. So again, tell me what doesn't work and tell me how the app can be better. And as far as hiring goes, we're hiring an Android engineer right now. That job should be posted either now or probably within like the week. But again, you can just DM me on Twitter and we'll make some connections. But yeah.
All right, very cool. Well, thanks so much for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you and learning more about mobile GitHub app. Thanks so much. Hopefully you stay safe out there and hope to see you in person one day.
Yeah, man. Yeah, you too. Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Hey there. I'm really impressed that you finished the entire video. Consider tweeting your feedback at me @Zat. Really appreciate your ideas. Bye-bye.